So the topic tonight is Eurasia. After the last session, we realized that this is probably too big and too intimidating a topic to start with. And I think that also points us, the previous session also points us to the question, how can we address something like this big, but still address it specifically? So in that spirit, I'll try to start with the now and the recent past to look at political discourses around Eurasia, but then to move us, as the evening progresses, into a much deeper past with stories and mythologies and ancient futures, so that we also get to think speculatively a little bit with Eurasia. So, situational awareness. When we talk about Eurasia, mostly we think of Europe and Asia as this geographical continent, except for Russian-speaking people. So when I first mentioned Eurasia with Russian friends, I was describing Eurasia as anywhere between west of Europe and east of the east of Asia, right? And then one person corrected me and said, you mean the other way around, right? You actually mean east of Europe and west of Asia, which brought me, of course, to this long research into Russian Eurasianism. This is a very specific Russian understanding of Eurasia. The most current political career it has is in the so-called Eurasianism, a right-wing political movement that has been on the surge since 20 years, headed by Russian political strategist Alexander Dugin. But this is not the first moment when Eurasianism came about. Dugin also goes back to this earlier moment of classical Eurasianism back in the 1920s, which was a theory that claimed full cultural relativism, acknowledging the opacities and differences of cultures in the context of a critique of Western dominance. So they basically demarcate different geocultures in the world or in this continent of Eurasia. As you see, there's the Chinese, Korean cultural world, there's the Arab world, there's other Turkic peoples, and then Western world. Russia, Eurasia is figured in the center of this continent as something that is not just European and not Asian either, but something in between. So they believed that each geocultural space has its own unique characters and should develop its own path to modernity. As such, it was a firm counter gesture to what they deemed as European cultural hegemony. So fast forward 100 years. The recent revival of Eurasianism with Alexander Dugin, who supported a party called Eurasian Party since the 2000s, they borrowed the intellectual resources of Eurasianism in fashioning essentially an anti-American, yet in effect, very neo-imperial Russian political movement. So in that sense, they support, for example, Russia's annexation of Crimea and also of part of Georgia. And Dugin's Eurasianism it celebrates Russia's expansionist agenda to build or to rebuild essentially this Eurasian sphere of influence in the image of the old Tsarist Russian Empire. And there's a lot of political and really quite sophisticated political foundations to his theory. Dugin is a trained Heideggerian, and you can also recognize Carl Schmitt's theory in his thinking. He's been invited, not coincidentally at all, to China. So this is the poster for his tour in China, and he was engaging with various top-notch Chinese intellectuals who share similar intellectual roots with him, but applying that to a more specific Chinese cultural sphere. of influence. So Dugin uses the ocean and the continent as a metaphor to describe the continental grounding of Russia, or Eurasia, Russia, Eurasia. And essentially, he condemns all the liberal-minded people in Russia as looking too much towards the ocean, that is, towards the West, but that Russia should reground itself in this continental, essentially, realm, which is connected to, again, all this cultural relativist discourses. So that is one instance of Eurasia. An earlier moment basically brings us back to the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. This is a map that the Japanese railway company produced from about 1920s, 30s. And you see, you have to basically imagine the map of East Asia tilted 90 degrees. And then you can see the connection. The island is Taiwan. All of that is East China. And then this goes down to the left to the Malaya world. And then here, warped down in the lower left corner is actually Indonesia. So Japan had steadily built its sphere of influence by a variety of means. In Manchuria, it started actually with the Southern Manchurian Railway Company. That was back in the 1930s. And on that map, you could see that Japan essentially connected itself via Korea, which it had subjugated in the early 20th century, via Manchuria, which is this vast swath of land in today's China, northeastern China. And then from there, you can go to the Trans-Siberian Railway, and that connects you all the way to Europe. And this was Japan's, on the map, it says Eurasian network. The reason why I like to mention this particular moment of Manchukuo, or Japanese occupied Manchuria, which you see better on this map, as part of the overall Japanese sphere of influence or conquest at the height. This is right before the turning point in the Second World War, of course, is that Japan had conquered all of these areas and countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia out of a political discourse called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Circle, right? And that has a lot of, again, philosophical underpinning. So I spent a few years looking at the Kyoto School. Many of them, or some of the most prominent proponents in the Kyoto School, a school of philosophy, were trained again by Heidegger, and had again, alarmingly close to what we just heard from Eurasianism, a culturalist understanding of this unique position of East Asia, where Japan is now supposed to take the lead in determining the fate of Asia, and in, of course, decolonizing Southeast Asian countries, which were occupied at the time by various European powers, right? So here you see this perversion again. A proclaimed decolonial project is actually the pretense for another neo-imperialist project of Japan. And specifically in Manchukuo, Japanese occupied Manchuria in the 30s and 40s, they had a lot of multicultural propaganda, such as this one on the stamp you see on the left. Manchuria, or Manchukuo, was supposed to be a land where 5 different peoples lived peacefully together. They are the Japanese, the Chinese, the Koreans, the Manchus, and the Mongols. And of course, that was so, it cannot be any further from the reality. So essentially, the Chinese and Koreans were treated as coolies. They were serving almost without remuneration in Japanese factories. The factory supplied essentially the entire armory for the Japanese army during the Second World War. And at the same time, they were intoxicated by opiums. So there was a very sophisticated system of appeasing the people who are essentially your slaves in the 30s and 40s in Manchuria. Now, coming to another map, they all bear similar. I think the similarity is that we see a lot of railways, but of course, this is the Belt and Road Project, the Belt and Road Initiative, a supranational infrastructure project now proposed by the Chinese government. To date, this initiative has expanded to around 70 countries in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and Oceania, incorporating 1/3 of global GDP and 1/4 of global foreign investment flows. I feel in Europe, people didn't quite pick up on this until maybe the Greek port Piraeus was acquired, or the Chinese ocean shipping company now owns a majority of shares of that company. And everything seems to be well and good until people here in the European Union start seeing shifts in the attitude of Greek politicians. So there were a few moments when concerning questions like if China is treating human rights in a proper way, the Greek members of the European Parliament actually switched side and spoke in favor of the Chinese. So everything is profiled under a kind of the new Marshall Plan, or kind of globalization 2.0, or globalization the Chinese way. But there are a lot of other political intentions underneath that. And also, for example, there has been a lot of concerns over debt trap that comes with Chinese investments. There was one case when the Sri Lanka government defaulted on a loan from the Chinese 2 years ago. And as a reparation for that default, they had to sell a 99-year lease to the Chinese, it's essentially a Chinese state-owned company, so that it grants China rights to use a port that you see. Sri Lanka is this little island south of the Indian subcontinent. So it grants China the right to use a port that is currently commercial, but can also be turned into a naval port if China wants to. And that has a very strategic, that place has a strategic position overlooking the Indian Ocean. We actually heard about this person just from Mia's presentation. So this was the Chinese admiral who sailed 5 times to Southeast Asia, Africa, and then the Near East. So China, of course, also uses self-power or historical narratives to profile this new Silk Road as something that is as peaceful or as pro-globalization as the old Silk Road or the old connections between China and the rest of the world. We don't actually learn in textbooks in China that of all these different expeditions that Zheng He, the admiral, embarked on. At least a few times it was not all that peaceful, and they actually abducted the king of Sri Lanka on one of the expeditions. So I'm working with an artist for the upcoming Shanghai Biennale, and a Singaporean artist called Chu Haopei, who's looking at sort of the story of Zheng He from the other side, and how Zheng He, the afterlife of this Chinese admiral, 600 years afterward, in various parts of Southeast Asia, still is so entangled with various political intentions. So Zheng He has been commemorated by the Chinese community in Southeast Asia. Zheng He has been actually deified into a folklore kind of god, a protection of sailors in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, for the Muslim community in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia and Malaysia, he has also been deified as a Muslim saint. And then there's also a depiction of Zheng He in a TV drama from the Philippines and enacted by Filipino actors. So the artist is looking at all these cultural manifestations and of Zheng He, and in a way that is looking at a story from the other side, that the Chinese dominant narratives on Zheng He and on the New Silk Road often overlook. So with this, you already see a kind of shift in how we approach Eurasia. Eurasia is not this grandiose narratives that are often connected to vexed interests and political intentions, but we're always trying to ask, what is it for us as time travelers and as divers into history and mythology? What can Eurasia be other than all of these political discourses that we just heard about? So with that, we're going to a slightly more relaxed and dreamy aspect of Eurasia. This is a different, a take two of Eurasia, right? Where you don't see borders, you see the natural kind of geological and geographical features of Eurasia. You see how it's connected. The steppes actually connect most of this continent, and how many of the rivers traverse through the continent. So that easily explains why you can find the same petroglyphs or similar petroglyph motifs in Central Asia, in Siberia, but also in Finland. We can also look at these kind of maps of Eurasia. This is the 11th to 12th century trade routes through Eurasia. Or in artistic imaginations, a long-term, rather fictive project collaboration between Nam June Paik and Yusuf Boyce on Eurasia. And I'm honoring Naf, who curated this wonderful show called Greetings from an Eurasian, a show on Boyce and his Eurasia project at MUCA, was it 2 years ago? So Paik and Boyce have both kind of, in a way romantically, imagined what Eurasia is for them in this rather cryptic dialogue. But, and elsewhere, Paik also mentioned that Eurasia for him is this prehistoric sci-fi. It's a network of information highway. And of course, he was thinking about the early internet, the early mass communication channels, and looking at Eurasia as an old network. But my contention here, or a kind of methodology that I want to bring in here, is that it's not enough to look at what had been there. as if all that motivates us is to look into the past and to find something that had been there, which we have today. Which is a little bit the feeling I have, again, for the previous session, in that diving into the past and just finding this maybe better days of multiculturalism doesn't actually serve us in understanding where we are today, and certainly doesn't help us understand how we get here. So what is more important is that we need to distill practices. If we're looking at Eurasia and networks, then how can we distill certain practices of distributed agency and responsibility, which may harbor transformative potential for today and for the future? And this is testifies to the way that we work with materials from both the past and the present, and in trying to fold them into each other by looking at transformations and what we can use for the future. So in that spirit, I'm taking you on a even trippier trip now. This is a modernist painting from a Russian painter called Igor Doni. He is from Magadan, which is in Russia northeast, almost bordering Alaska. The painting itself is actually of no significance. I found it randomly in a museum in Vladivostok. What is interesting about this painting is that he took motifs from ancient petroglyphs that you will find in that part of the world. These motifs are, of course, deers and sharks or whales. It's not uncommon to find deers as a motif in petroglyphs throughout Siberia, Central Asia, again, all the way to Eastern Europe or Finland. For deer is this ancient emblem that served as a medium between the human realm and the heaven, or the heaven god, or Tengri in some of these. That's the name of this heaven god in some of the religions in Central Asia. And it's believed to be this medium because of the shape of the antlers. The whale is also not an uncommon motif in these cultures that lived along the sea. But the interesting feature about this painting is that they were painted together. And there are at least 3 sources that I have identified, one from a Taoist mythology, one from a Korean crazy media archaeologist who used to work at the Namjin Paik Center, and someone else, that basically speculate on the fact that the deer and the whale are the same thing. So the deer either had jumped back into the ocean and became the whale, because the whale is the only kind of anti-modern animal that we have on this planet, or there's another form of transformation which is recorded in the Taoist story, in which any kind of being can morph into another. So the speculative part is actually not just for entertainment, but to help us ask the question: why do we have so little myths today, right? Because we used to tell Earth stories. The stories that we had thousands of years ago were all Earth stories. And then slowly we lost them. We slowly are too concerned with the human morals, so we started telling human stories. Maybe just in the recent past, we start telling or retelling Earth stories with this idea of the Gaia, or Latour's most recent book, Return to Earth. But how can we learn to re-enchant ourselves by myth in a way that we can position ourselves almost in awe or in this more humble position against things that are much larger than ourselves, right? Which that's something that we could probably take away from mythology. Another snapshot. I spent a lot of time doing this. I spent a lot of time talking to archaeologists and looking at archaeology collections from Central Asia. It's so on the left side you see all these studies on motifs, what they possibly mean. That's all quite standard kind of archaeological and art history business. But what I found in a town in central Siberia called Tomsk is this other object that's rather curious, which is a meta object. It's the cauldron with which the nomads, this is a particular culture called Kule, that resided in that area between the 500 before the Common Era and 500 after. And the cauldron is what they used to cast and recast all this bronzeware that they had. It's not usual that you see this sort of meta project, which conditions the production of all these other objects that you see, and then you study for art history. So that leads to the thinking that, of course, the nomads, they've always, they're actually the first peoples to master metallurgy. They would always carry gold or silver or bronze plaques and jewelry as they move around. These objects are not just easy to transport, but they also pertain to, this is Deleuze and Guattari's famous chapter on nomadology. They also pertain to the object only as object in motion. These plaques constitute traits of expression of pure speed carried on objects that are themselves mobile and moving. So this continuous motion and the continuous necessity to cast and recast according to the need and according to where you are gives us a rather different understanding of it than if we approach it from our history. And that is a more materialist approach. It's about looking at how the material condition makes you have to rebalance the materials at hand given a certain condition. And it's also a social metaphor if we take a slightly speculative leap, in that we could ask, what if we do not observe the individual as discrete entities, but as changing composites with all the social forces? How can we engage in meaningful ways as part of a larger community beyond individualist interests while not being struck by the fear of losing oneself? And why are we afraid of losing oneself when we're so lonely in the contemporary society? Yeah, another speculative snapshot is, again, these are really quite curious objects. These are family tokens found in a community called the Udmurtians. The Udmurtians are a group of Finno-Ugric language-speaking people that live some, I don't know the kilometer, but I know it's 12 hours from Ekaterinburg. So west of the Ural Mountains, if you take this extremely slow Russian train, 12 hours, you arrive in the city called Ijevsk. And this is where, in the local history museum, I found these objects, and I asked the archaeologists about its meaning. So these are family tokens that are a sign of property and possession. And the archaeologist said, in a very technical way, if somebody finds a tree with a hollow of wild bees, he could mark it by his family sign and this tree, and the hollow becomes his property. So it's used for landmarking, marking of animals, marking on traditional fabrics, carpets, and even gates. It's also used as a signature of documents and could be sold. The origin of family signs goes back to the names of mothers of the female prophets who protected the clan. So it was also used as an amulet. And as you see with the description of how you can apply the family token in exchanges, it worked sort of as a precedent of money, or it's a money intermediary. But then the exchange they facilitate actually encompass something beyond what money intermediary can capture. So not the standard unit of measurement of value, but it's sensation, it's history, and stories around families that also get exchanged as you exchange the family tokens. Also, the family tokens can be carved onto trees, designating a natural resource as somewhere between private ownership, although this is not exactly a concept of ownership, more like custodianship. And if you think about the abundance of trees in the Siberian taiga, and what it would mean if you carve your own family token onto that, it's almost a wealth that is potentially endless. And with that, the responsibility towards nature also grow proportionately. So there is something that is in the effect of not money as this universal unit of exchange, but something more like an index of sociality at play in this family token and how it is used. And I'll just very briefly, so there's a YouTube video showing you how do you actually make a family token and mark it on this tree. And I'll just very briefly walk you through some other maps. This is the oldest star atlas of its kind, dating back to around 700 in the Common Era, where you can see this is found in Dunhuang in Western China today, where you can see the concern is not just astrological sciences, but also universal omens and cosmological righteousness. So as such, with my colleague Yu Hui, who works on this idea of cosmotechnics, we've been discussing a lot of such old instances of cosmotechnics. Similarly, other star atlases that you can find carved onto stones. This is in the Levant part of the world, where what used to be considered, because the scientists couldn't decipher it in the beginning for many years, they thought these signs are place names or these are records of history. But the most recent archaeological finding revealed the fact that these are actually star atlases. So that once again gives us this nice image of a movement that is a three-way movement. So then as you're moving, as your bodies are moving through the desert, and the stars are moving above you, you're trying to constitute a third movement that creates a man-heaven equilibrium. And it's this kind of multiple movement that we're interested in as mappers of Eurasia. So that leads me to the project of Eurasian Underground Library, which you will see tomorrow. It's a course that Bina Choi and myself taught at the Dutch Art Institute last year. And two of the students are present, Zoe and Sepidi. And they will give you a physical enactment or collective experience of the Eurasian Underground Library, which came out of the course last year. So with all of these mappings of first with the political discourses as I started with, and then with these more speculative mapping methods, we steadily arrived at an approach to Eurasia that is below or beyond the grand narratives of Eurasia, but rather that is something that can be embodied and enacted by each of us. And only in these moments of physical enacting can we claim that Eurasia is nowhere but now here. So I say this as the last statement to honor the collective work that we came to in the end at the end of the Dutch Art Institute. Thank you.